They called her facilities. 10 minutes later, the entire Harvard lecture hall fell silent. Late October in Cambridge. The wind was crisp, and the scent of damp leaves mixed with the distant warmth of old library books. At the far end of the Maxwell Dworkin building, home to Harvard's School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, a public seminar was underway. And in the very back row, sitting so still she seemed part of the shadows, was a woman in a worn gray cardigan. Her name was Grace, 37 years old, single mother, and the night janitor for the building. At the front of the room, Professor Edwin Roth was mid-sentence. He was sketching diagrams on the blackboard, talking about the science of restoring images taken in extremely low light, images so faint they were buried under layers of distortion. "We're not just enhancing photographs," he said. "We're recovering what the eye could never see." Grace didn't understand all the words, but something in his voice, something about recovering what was almost lost, moved her in a way she couldn't name. She had once tried to recover something too. A face, a memory, a goodbye that came too soon. A whisper floated across the rows. "Is she... facilities?" "She's the cleaning lady, right?" A student chuckled, not cruelly, but not kindly either. Grace heard them. She didn't flinch. Her hand rested on a notebook she'd been filling for 3 years. Notes taken after midnight, scribbled thoughts between vacuuming and mopping, bits of lectures caught from behind the door, pieced together like a puzzle only she could see. Not to become a scientist, but to understand the last blurry photo of the man she loved. Professor Roth kept speaking. He was simplifying the problem now, saying that the camera's data could be assumed to be clean enough, that it wouldn't distort the image too much if the math treated the sensors as perfectly aligned. Grace's brow furrowed. That wasn't how cameras worked in the real world. She had spent hours adjusting broken lenses, trying to fix grainy, almost dark photos. She knew distortion didn't just blur, it lied. And when you ignored that, you lost something that couldn't be brought back. She looked down at her notes, then up again, and for the first time in any lecture hall, she raised her hand. Heads turned. She stood, slowly, carefully. Her voice was soft, but clear. "I think the assumption about the sensors might be off," she said. "In real low light, the noise doesn't behave the way the model says. You'd lose detail in the darkest parts." Professor Roth paused, chalk still in hand. He looked at her. "I'm sorry. Are you suggesting an alternative model?" he asked, not unkindly. Grace nodded. "I'm suggesting you might need to weight the image differently, use prior knowledge, and don't ignore what the darkness is trying to say." There was a long silence. No one laughed. One of the graduate students whispered, "She's not one of us, is she?" But no one answered, because every now and then, even at Harvard, the room shifts. Status, background, job titles. None of it matters when truth walks in quietly. Grace stood in that moment, wearing a second-hand cardigan, with calloused hands that had mopped these floors for years, and yet everyone was listening. Professor Roth stared at the board for a second longer, then back at Grace. He nodded, slightly, thoughtfully. "Come up," he said. "Show us what you mean." She stepped forward. Her hands trembled, just a little, but her eyes did not. Perhaps she would be wrong. Perhaps they wouldn't understand. But for the first time in many years, Grace didn't feel invisible. She belonged. And in that quiet moment, as chalk met board and daylight faded through the glass, the janitor began to teach Harvard something it had forgotten. There are moments in life that feel longer than they are, not because of fear, but because something quiet inside you has just shifted, and the world hasn't caught up yet. Grace stood in front of the chalkboard, still unsure why her legs had moved. The old cardigan felt too thin. Her fingers, used to gripping a mop, now held a piece of chalk. And yet, something about the silence in the room felt kind. She turned toward the board. Behind her, 100 eyes watched. Not with scorn, not anymore, but with the cautious, respectful quiet reserved for things we almost overlooked. "I'm not trained like you," she began. Her voice was even, but soft, like someone used to being spoken over. "I just noticed something. When you take pictures in near darkness, the noise isn't just random. It has a shape, and it grows in places where the light is weakest." Professor Roth stood off to the side, arms crossed, brow furrowed, but not dismissively. Grace continued. "If you assume the camera's sensors are perfect, your math behaves as if all errors are equal, but they're not. The darker areas lie more." Someone in the front row started typing. Another opened a notebook. Grace kept speaking, not as a scientist, but as someone who had lived with broken machines, cheap equipment, and memories too fragile to risk distortion. "In my case," she said, "I used to adjust the shadows by hand. I would guess where edges should be. I'd try to preserve the outline of a person's face, even if it was buried in grain. It was never perfect, but—" Her voice faltered. "But sometimes you just want to see someone again, even if it's just a little clearer." Roth stepped forward. He didn't take the chalk. Instead, he pointed to what she had drawn, simple sketches of a diagram with noise distributed unevenly. "You're suggesting we treat darker regions with more care," he said. Grace nodded. "Not all parts of the picture are equal, and not all noise should be ignored." "Some of it is telling you where not to trust." There was a long silence. Then gently, Roth asked, "What would you do differently?" Grace hesitated. "Maybe emphasize what we know," she said. "Use a method that adds weight to expected features, edges, contours, and make sure no value goes negative. Because darkness isn't absence. It's just unspoken detail." Someone from the research team raised a hand. "Do you have this written down?" Grace reached into her canvas bag, the one she always kept under the cleaning cart, and pulled out a small notebook. The pages were soft with age, filled with pencil marks and thumb smudges. She passed it forward. Later, they would talk about what was in that notebook. The hand-drawn graphs showing how grain increased in shadow. The notes comparing images restored by hand, by free software, and by her own strange, careful method. The phrase written over and over again in the margins, "Trust the dark, but test it gently." But in that moment, no one cared about graphs. They were watching her. Not just a janitor, not just a woman in the wrong room, but someone who had seen what others missed. Not through math, but through love. Roth looked at her, his voice now quieter. "What's your name?" She looked down, a little embarrassed. "Grace Whitaker?" He nodded once. "Well, Grace, would you be willing to stop by our lab one evening?" She blinked. "I don't know how I could help." "You already did," he said. As she walked back to her seat, someone in the audience whispered, "She doesn't even have a degree." Another answered, "Maybe she doesn't need one." And somewhere in the corner of that tall glass room, where the afternoon sun had long faded, a woman in a cardigan sat down quietly and felt for the first time in years that her voice had landed. The lab was quiet after hours. Not empty, but quiet in a way that felt respectful, like walking into an old chapel where the only sound was the hum of the machines breathing in the dark. Grace stepped in slowly, her canvas bag still over her shoulder. Her cleaning cart had been left by the elevator, just for tonight. One of the young research assistants, a soft-spoken man named Omar, had been the one to meet her in the hallway. "Your Grace?" he asked, as though still confirming something unlikely. She nodded. He smiled. "We've been reading your notebook." It wasn't a lab she ever thought she'd see from the inside. The whiteboards were covered in colorful, unfinished diagrams. Screens glowed with frozen frames from low-light test images. Photographs so dim they looked like memories from a half-forgotten dream. Some were medical scans. Others looked like starlight or the edges of distant roads in night surveillance footage. Grace recognized the noise. Not the kind that makes sound, but the kind that fogs meaning. The kind that makes people disappear. Omar handed her back the notebook. He had slipped a sticky note inside. "Page 18. The margin," he said. "That phrase you wrote, weighted kindness. That's what caught our attention." She opened to it. There, next to a sketch of a face emerging from darkness, she had written months ago. "Maybe the math is wrong because it assumes light is the only thing that matters. But what if we weighted the shadows too? Not punished them, just listened more carefully. Weighted kindness." No one had ever called her words beautiful before. Not in math, not in life. She didn't know how to answer, so she just whispered, "I was just thinking out loud." The team gathered. They weren't all young. One professor had gray in his beard and kindness in his eyes. Another woman in a lab coat looked like she hadn't slept in days, but offered Grace tea with quiet gratitude. Together they ran a comparison. 3 algorithms, same data, same conditions. First, the standard one used by most imaging labs. Second, Roth's own model, with slight improvements. Third, a prototype based on Grace's notes, hand-transcribed into code by Omar over the weekend. The results loaded slowly. One by one, the screen began to split into 3 panels. The same dim photo, a child's face in a nearly dark room, restored differently by each method. The first 2 showed vague outlines. The third had eyes, not perfect, not clear as daylight. But you could see the child's eyes, the curve of the cheek, a glimmer of something unmistakably human. The room went still. No applause, no exclamations, just the quiet recognition of something true. Someone behind Grace murmured, "That's not supposed to be possible with this data." Another whispered, "That's real light." Omar turned to her, hesitant. "How did you even know it would work?" Grace looked at the screen. She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I didn't." Pause. "I just didn't want the face to disappear." That night, the team didn't ask her to clean. They offered her a chair. And while she sat there, watching code scroll across the screen and test images flicker with new clarity, Grace realized something. She wasn't here as a guest. She was here because her way of seeing mattered. And in the strange rhythm of a place built for brilliance, sometimes the brightest light comes from someone who spent her life working in the dark. They scheduled the test for a Tuesday evening, not during class hours, and not in secret either. It was something in between, public, but quiet, just like her. The room was smaller than a lecture hall, but large enough for 30 or 40 people to sit and watch. No lights, except the glow of the projector screen and the cold blue LEDs on the equipment racks. Grace sat in the second row, not the back this time. They had saved her a seat with a notepad and warm tea. She didn't drink it. Her hands were already full, holding her breath. On the screen, 3 names appeared, each one next to a small icon of an image being reconstructed. Baseline model Roth variant Whittaker prototype. They had insisted on putting her name there. Grace had asked them not to. She had said gently, I don't need my name on anything. I just wanted to help. But Omar had smiled at her and said simply, You already did. Now let them see. The data they used came from the university's internal testing archive. Real, low-light images taken under controlled conditions. Photos that had stumped students and researchers for years. Dark corridors, old manuscripts scanned under candlelight. One photo of a man's face, barely visible in a flicker of streetlight, used again and again as a benchmark. The rules were clear. Same image, same parameters, same noise level. The only difference was how each method tried to listen to the dark. They ran the first model. The crowd watched as the image sharpened, but not much. The outlines came forward, but the shadows fell apart. It was, in every technical sense, acceptable. But something human was missing. They ran the second. Roth's version was more advanced. It preserved more detail around edges, removed more of the visual grain. It was, undeniably, better. A few people in the back clapped quietly. Roth stood with his arms folded, not smiling, but satisfied. And then, the third. Grace didn't look at the screen. She couldn't. She looked at her hands instead. They were calloused from mopping, from carrying buckets, from holding her daughter's head through fevers. They had not touched a computer until 5 years ago. Now those hands had changed something no one expected. The image appeared. Gasps. Then silence. It wasn't just sharper. It was gentler. The shadows didn't vanish. They softened. The light wasn't brighter. It was truer. In the photo of the man's face, for the first time, you could see his eyes. Not just as pixels, but as someone. Someone who had been trying to be seen. A professor in the front row leaned in. "This isn't filtering," she said. "It's reconstruction with respect." Another older one murmured, "I didn't think this level of fidelity was possible from that data." And then came the voice Grace feared most. Roth. From the back of the room, he said one word. How? Grace stood, though no one had asked her to. She spoke slowly, not from a podium, just from where she stood, one foot on the floor, one on a lifetime of silence. "I don't know all the math," she said, "but I know the mistake we keep making. We assume data doesn't feel. We treat noise like something to delete." She looked at the image again, finally, then back at the room. "But sometimes, what we call noise is just memory, blurred, bruised, but real. And if you weight it kindly, it begins to speak." There was no applause at first, just stillness. Then, one pair of hands softly clapping, then another, until the whole room filled with the sound of people not just impressed, but moved. Moved by the woman who didn't belong here. And yet, was the only one who had truly listened. Later that night, someone asked Roth what he thought. He didn't answer. Not directly. He just walked up to the screen, stared at the image again, and quietly erased his own model from the comparison. Grace walked home that night under a street light dimmer than most, but something inside her felt luminous, because for the first time in years, she had shown them something they didn't know how to measure. Proof, not just of an idea, but of a person. It came quietly, not as an accusation. Not as an insult, but as a small whisper in the hallway. A soft remark, spoken just loud enough to survive the silence between two lectures. "Have you seen that new preprint? Looks almost identical." Grace was cleaning the edge of a whiteboard when she heard it. She paused, the rag in her hand damp with old marker ink. The voice didn't notice her. No one ever really did. That night, when the building emptied, Grace walked to the small lab where Omar sometimes stayed late. His light was on. His laptop was open. His eyes were tired. She knocked softly. He looked up and smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "There's something you should see," he said. He turned the screen toward her. It was a draft paper. Newly posted on an academic archive, unsigned but linked to a private lab and a startup no one at Harvard seemed to know well. The title was different, the language more formal. But the heart of it, the method, the structure, the way it listened to the dark, was too familiar. Grace leaned in, reading slowly. They had rewritten the idea, stripped it of warmth. No mention of weighted kindness, no notebook sketches, no grace, not even a nod. She didn't speak, not right away. Omar waited. He watched her expression closely, not for anger, but for something deeper. Disbelief. Not that it had happened, but that it had happened here, at a place that promised truth. "Who wrote this?" she finally asked. Omar hesitated. "One of Roth's former assistants," he said quietly. "He left the group a few months ago. There's talk he's consulting for a startup in imaging, medical diagnostics, maybe surveillance tech. We don't know." Grace nodded slowly. The dots were easy enough to connect. But she wasn't angry. Not yet. She was tired. The next morning, she was called into a small office on the 3rd floor. It wasn't Roth who met her. It was a woman in a navy blazer, crisp voice, polite smile. Legal affairs. "We've been informed," the woman said, "that some of the content in your notes may have relevance to a developing intellectual property case. It would help if you could share the full contents, so we can better protect your work." Grace raised her eyes. "Protect it from who?" The woman smiled again, that carefully practiced curve. "From misuse." "Of course." They offered her a document to sign. A non-disclosure agreement. No specifics, just standard language. Harmless, they said. Grace held the pen, then gently set it down. "I've cleaned this building for 6 years," she said. "I've wiped your whiteboards, scrubbed your floors, and picked up the coffee cups after your meetings." She looked the woman in the eye, steady. "And not once did I ask to be let in." Pause. "But now that I am, I'm not handing over what I built in the dark so someone else can lock it in a room with their name on the door." The woman's smile didn't change, but she closed the folder. "Very well," she said. "You'll be hearing from the university." That night, Grace sat in the library. Not the lab, not the seminar rooms. The library. She found her usual corner. Wooden table. Lamp with warm yellow glow. A place where her daughter had once done homework beside her, while Grace studied camera noise from worn-out textbooks. She pulled out her notebook. The original one. Not the scanned version. Not the copy they'd seen. The real one. Every page written with her hand. Every idea born from the kind of loneliness most people spend a lifetime trying to forget. She didn't cry. Not from fear, not from defeat. She just whispered to herself like a prayer. They can borrow the words. They can borrow the math. But they'll never carry it the way I did. Because ideas born in silence, in grief, in hunger, in love. They don't live in ink. They live in people. And this one lived in her. The hearing wasn't called a hearing. At Harvard, they called it a reproduction colloquium, a formal title for an informal storm. It was held in the Pierce Hall conference room. No students, no recordings, just a panel of faculty, some invited observers, and 3 laptops connected to a single overhead projector. They weren't investigating Grace. They were investigating the truth. Grace arrived 5 minutes early, not by accident. She wore the same gray cardigan, the same canvas bag, not as a statement, just because it was hers. Omar stood near the corner, silent but present. A few professors nodded as she entered, some with kindness, some with curiosity, some with the kind of silence people reserve for things they don't understand but sense they ought to. The chair of the panel cleared her throat. We've received a formal inquiry regarding overlapping contributions in recent imaging research. This session is to reproduce the results, compare methods, and determine authorship clarity. Grace didn't flinch. She just opened her notebook and placed it on the table. Not to read from, to remind herself that what she brought didn't begin in code. It began in grief, and it grew in love. The process began. 3 identical datasets, 3 models, the baseline, the contested preprint, Grace's original formulation. Everything would be coded live, from scratch. No copy-pasting, no pre-compiled functions. A young postdoc handled the scripts. Grace sat beside him, explaining each step. Not in jargon, in memory. "Start with the image," she said. "Don't clean it yet. Just let it speak." Pause. Add weight where the edges fade. Not where the brightness lies, but where it wants to return. The postdoc hesitated. "How do I know where that is?" She smiled. "You'll feel it." The models ran. One after another, each processed the same photo. An old woman in a hospital bed, her features barely visible in the dark. The first model erased the noise, but also erased her wrinkles. The second sharpened the shape, but left cold outlines, hollow and harsh. Then came Grace's. The image built slowly, pixel by pixel, like someone remembering, until the woman's face emerged, lines intact, eyes soft, light returning not with force, but with permission. The room went still. A professor leaned forward. "How is it preserving softness without blurring structure?" Grace turned to him gently. "Because it isn't trying to fix the photo. It's trying to understand it." Another asked, "You're not using any new math, just rearranged emphasis?" She nodded. "I didn't invent anything. I just stopped ignoring what didn't fit the model." Then came the final question. "Why do you think your model sees more?" Grace paused. She looked not at the panel, but at the image of the old woman. Then she said softly, "Because I've spent years looking at people who were being forgotten." No one replied. Not with words. Only silence. The kind that happens when something true has landed. That evening, the panel published their findings. The model in the preprint was built on Grace's original notes. The code structure, though rewritten, bore clear conceptual trace. Authorship had been misattributed. Grace Whitaker was the originator of the third model. They did not say she was right because she had proof. They said she was right because she had seen what others missed, and taught them how to see it too. Afterward, Roth approached her. He didn't offer excuses, just a pause. Then one hand outstretched. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner," he said. Grace looked at his hand, then shook it gently. "It's all right," she said. "You see it now." And that was enough. Not because it changed everything, but because it changed something. And in the world Grace came from, that was already a miracle. Success, when it finally came, did not knock. It rang non-stop. Emails, invitations, private messages from people with glossy profiles and vague promises, venture capital firms, imaging startups, medical companies. They called it recognition. But it came dressed in ownership. One message stood out. A medical tech company, new but well-funded, offered to license Grace's algorithm exclusively. 7 figures. Up front. It would be used, they said, to improve cancer imaging in rural hospitals. Grace read the words twice. The phrase, "for people who can't afford to be misdiagnosed," clung to her chest like a child's hand. Another message came from a defense contractor. They offered a research position. Quiet, behind closed doors. No publication, no public access. But important work, they said. Security, border surveillance, applications they couldn't fully disclose. And then, there was the one that didn't come in an email. It came in the form of a scholarship flyer, Harvard's full-tuition STEM award for dependents of staff. She turned it over. It had her daughter's name written all over it. Grace sat at her kitchen table that night. The apartment was quiet. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, a science book open on her chest, her pencil still in her hand. Grace stared at the numbers, the offers, the possibilities, and the silence between them. She wasn't afraid of money. She had lived without it. She wasn't afraid of institutions. She had cleaned them. But she was afraid of forgetting what the algorithm was born from, what it had been meant to do. The next morning, she walked back into the same lab where it had all begun. Roth was there. So was Omar. So was the woman in the navy blazer from legal. This time, Grace brought something in her hand. A printed page. "I've made a decision," she said. They waited. "I'll release the core algorithm publicly. Open code. Open testing. Free to use in medical and astronomical imaging." She looked up, calm. "But not for surveillance, not for weapon systems, and not for anyone who hides behind NDAs and locked doors." The legal advisor opened her mouth. Grace held up a hand. "I'll accept funding. I'll even collaborate. But only if every step is open and traceable. I won't let the light be used to erase people." Roth blinked. "You'll give it away?" Grace shook her head. "I'm not giving it away. I'm giving it back. To the people it came from." There was silence. Then Roth did something she didn't expect. He smiled. Not politely. Genuinely. That week, Grace published the code with Omar's help. They uploaded it to a public repository. They attached documentation, written in plain language, and they included a note. This work was born from images no one thought could be saved. May it help recover what still waits in the dark. Some said she was naive, that someone would steal it again, that corporations would rebrand it, sell it, spin it into something she never intended. Maybe. But Grace wasn't protecting a formula. She was protecting a line. The line between building something for power and building something for remembrance. That night, her daughter read the flyer. "Harvard?" Emily whispered. Grace nodded. "They said yes." Emily threw her arms around her. "You didn't sell it?" "No," Grace whispered into her hair. "We're keeping the light on." The internet, as always, moved faster than truth. And yet somehow, truth caught up. Not with fury, not with threats, but with something much quieter. Documentation. Within a week of Grace's public release, the algorithm had been forked over 100 times by research groups around the world. Germany, Japan, Nigeria, medical labs, astronomy departments. Even a high school team in Kansas sent her a thank you email. They called it the Whitaker method. Grace never asked them to. They just knew. But not everyone was pleased. The startup behind the earlier anonymous preprint issued a quiet statement, hinting at prior claims. A few blogs picked it up. Some whispered about legal disputes. The usual noise. Grace didn't reply. She didn't write press statements or hire lawyers. She just uploaded one more thing. A simple folder. Public. Time-stamped. Reconstruction Journals, 2019 to present. Inside were her scans, her notebook pages, photos of Emily's homework in the margins, handwritten reflections, test images, mistakes, corrections, retries, all there. No polish, no spin, just the slow, honest record of someone who tried to bring a face back from the dark. And suddenly, the conversation shifted. People stopped asking who owned the algorithm. They started asking who lived it. A prominent data ethics blog ran a feature. The light that belonged to her, how a janitor taught Harvard to see again. Another post from a former Roth assistant quietly withdrew authorship from the contested preprint. No explanation. Just gone. By the end of the month, even the most skeptical voices had fallen quiet. Emily brought home a printed article one afternoon. It had Grace's name in bold. She held it like a certificate. "Mom," she said, "you're in the paper." Grace smiled. "I used to clean under those racks. Now my name's on top." But she hadn't done it for that. She had done it because no one should have to fight for what's already true, and because sometimes the best defense is to be so open, so honest, that lies cannot survive the light. In a quiet moment, Grace stood in the lab again. This time, not as a visitor, not as staff, but as a listed co-author on a published, peer-reviewed paper with her name first. It didn't say Dr. Grace Whitaker. It just said Grace Whitaker. That was enough. Because everything that mattered was already there in the light. The classroom was small, not a lecture hall, not a lab, just one of the older seminar rooms tucked inside the Whitaker building with creaky floors, a dusty chalkboard, and windows that held the last gold of the setting sun. Grace had asked for it quietly. No grant, no fanfare, just a room, once a week, after hours. On the door, she taped a sign, handwritten, uneven letters. "If you've ever felt like you didn't belong here, this room is for you." The first evening, only one student came. She wore a sweater too big for her, eyes too tired for her age. She didn't ask about image reconstruction. She asked if it was okay to just sit. Grace poured her tea. "Of course," she said. "Sit as long as you like." By the third week, there were 5 of them. By the 6th, 12. Some were undergrads. Some weren't even students. One was a woman who cleaned the biology building. One was a boy who delivered food and stayed to listen from the hallway. Grace began each session the same way. She'd erase the board, draw a line, and then write, "What do you want to see more clearly?" They didn't always talk about images. Sometimes they talked about being the only girl in a coding class, or about missing family overseas, or about how hard it was to believe you were smart when no one had ever said so. Sometimes they just sat. There was always tea. When someone finally asked about the algorithm, Grace didn't explain it with equations. She said, "It listens to the parts we used to throw away and gives them a voice." Then she added, "You can do that too, with people, with yourself." They started bringing their own images. Blurry photos of their childhood homes, old VHS frames of relatives long gone, telescope shots of stars that hadn't quite shown up, scanned letters, forgotten film rolls, proof of something once lost. Grace showed them how to clean gently, not erase, not sharpen too hard, just help the memory find its way back. One night, the girl in the oversized sweater whispered, "I used to think I didn't belong here." Grace smiled. "You still might not, she said kindly. "But that doesn't mean you're wrong to be here." The tea got stronger each week, the light softer. People stopped asking what Grace's title was. They just started calling it Whitaker Evenings. And somehow across campus, the phrase began to mean something more than a room and a woman with chalk. It meant, come as you are, bring what you have, let it be enough. Grace would sit in the back sometimes, watching the room she had once cleaned become a place of warmth. Not power, not brilliance, just a place where light could rest. And though she had been published, praised, and written about in journals now, this was the legacy she wanted. Not the method, not the math, but the space for someone else to begin. The invitation arrived by mail. Thick paper, gold trim, the Harvard seal embossed in quiet dignity. Inside, the words were plain. Colloquium Series. Fall Term. The Whitaker Reconstruction. Weighted Poisson. Inference with non-negativity and total variation. Keynote lecture and acknowledgement ceremony presenter, G. Whitaker. Grace read it twice, then set it down next to the dish rack where it stayed untouched for days. It wasn't nerves, it wasn't pride. It was something else, something tender and fragile, like looking at a childhood photo you didn't know had been saved. She had never expected this, not from them, not from anyone. Certainly not in a room with velvet chairs and carved wood podiums. When the day came, she wore a clean gray dress. Simple, unpressed in places. Emily walked beside her, holding her hand. "Are you going to speak?" the girl asked. Grace looked down. "I think I'm going to thank." The hall was full, not just with professors and researchers, but students, janitors. A librarian she once spoke to every night after closing. Even Omar's mother had come. Roth was there. So were most of the people who had once asked her to explain herself. This time, they just waited. The chair of the department stepped up first. He spoke briefly, with words like contribution, methodology, and impact. Then he cleared his throat, looked down at his notes, and added, "But more than that, Ms. Whitaker reminded us that clarity is not always a matter of computation. Sometimes it is a matter of care." And then they called her name. She didn't speak from the podium. She stood beside it, both feet grounded, voice low but clear. "I never wanted my name on anything," she began. "I just wanted to remember something and help others do the same." She looked out at the faces. So many had forgotten hers. None would forget it now. "This work didn't start with a formula," she continued. "It started with a photo I couldn't clean, and a grief I couldn't name." Her hand trembled slightly as she took out the notebook, the original one. She held it up softly. "This is where the work lives, in what we keep, and what we give away." No applause. Not yet. Just breath held. And then, one by one, the room rose. No cheers. Just standing, in quiet respect, not for what she had built, but for the way she had carried it. Later that week, the Harvard Gazette ran a story. The headline read, "Hands that cleaned the hall became hands that reconstructed the image." And below it, a quote from Grace. "At some point, I stopped needing to prove I belonged. I just started building the kind of room where others would." In the evenings, back in the small classroom at Whitaker, the chalkboard was always dusty with sketches. No one erased them right away. Grace would sip tea and listen, not just to models and images, but to the laughter of girls who never thought they'd speak in rooms like these. And one night, after everyone had left, she stood alone at the board. She looked at her hands. Hands that once held a mop, held a notebook, held a child through the dark, and now held nothing. Because finally, they were free. She picked up the chalk, wrote just one sentence, and left it for whoever came next. This light belongs to all of us. If you've stayed with us through all 10 chapters of Grace's story, thank you. This wasn't just a tale about algorithms or universities. It was about light. The kind we lose, the kind we fight for, and the kind we pass on quietly without needing our name in lights. If her story touched you, if you saw a part of yourself in the silence she carried, we invite you to stay a little longer. Subscribe to the channel, not for more noise, but for more warmth. More stories where dignity walks quietly and healing takes its time. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, a light you thought had gone out might find its way back.